Hello, everyone. It's Lindsay with one of my stories, and I'm on here today to do a review of Dungeons and Dragons Honor Among Thieves, which is put out by Paramount Pictures. The movie is co-directed by John Francis Daly, Jonathan Goldstein. They have worked together and made another movie called Game Night, and it added in the writing of Michael Gillio. The movie is starring Chris Pine, Michelle Rodriguez, Justice Smith, Sophia Lillis, Regé-Jean and Hugh Grant. What's it about? Fresh out of prison, Edgin the Bard and his trusty sidekick, Holga the Barbarian, set out to reclaim his daughter and an object of power that promises new hope for his family. So what we have is a very standard fantasy story with a band of unlikely heroes that go on a quest together. And on the way, they will encounter friends and foes, magical creatures, and possibly have to adapt their carefully laid plans. It's very difficult these days to make a good fantasy movie. You can tell because we don't get too many fantasy movies anymore. These days, fantasy seems to have been relegated to the realm of television. Check me on this. Think about what fantasy people have been watching these days. Game of Thrones, The Rings of Power, Shadow and Bone, the spinoff of Game of Thrones. They're all on streaming television series. And it's something I really hadn't thought about until I sat down and was looking at when is the last time that there was a fantasy movie like this made where there's the quests and all that. In 2021, we had The Green Knight, but let's face it, that is in a little bit of a different category because it's subverting that trope, and that's also not a family-friendly type of movie. This is trying to appeal to the masses. And this franchise is banking on the universal love of the Dungeons and Dragons role-playing game to break through that barrier. The plot feels very much like when you're playing a game, as I understand it, where you have to lay plans. You sometimes need to go on side quests to get to that next leg of your journey, and then you might have to form a new plan. Also, perhaps they feel it's the right time with the popularity of Stranger Things. That show sort of gave Dungeons and Dragons a boost. You can't say it made the game popular because the game has been popular for a really long time, but it was featured very much in that series, especially played by Eddie, which everybody loves Eddie. And even I, who have never played Dungeons and Dragons and have never had any interest, was captivated by the gameplay they showed, and it made me sort of want to play the game. So I can imagine other people have maybe, since Stranger Things, even more people have maybe started to play. But the movie also tries to make it accessible to people who don't play the game or don't necessarily like straight up fantasy because they added in comedy, adventure, and a heist into the mix. So there are all sorts of hooks to bring people in. So even if you don't like D&D, there's something else you might enjoy. And the movie is really entertaining. I enjoyed myself. Chris Pine and Michelle Rodriguez are great together, and they're fun, and they play sort of like a chosen family. They're not a couple, not romantically linked, but they had really good banter. And then just bringing in these other characters into the mix with Justice Smith, as he plays a sorcerer that keeps failing and is trying to get it right and boost his confidence. And then we had Sophia Lillis as Doric the Druid. Regé-Jean brings a unique factor into the movie because he has more of a dry sense of humor, so he's playing against that comedy that we're enjoying, and having him come in and play against the comedy is actually very funny. So there's great chemistry between the characters, there's humor, I laughed, there's good quests, some solid camera work. But here's the problem: there just wasn't anything special about it to make it necessary to continue and make a franchise. And you can tell Paramount is really gunning for that option because of the spinoffs they've promised and they've made toys. To compare it to something like Lord of the Rings, which it's hard to compare anything to that, but the point I'm trying to make is each of the 3 movies in that series was a thing unto itself, but there was the overarching plot also of taking the One Ring to Mordor, and everything was leading up to that. So there was this overarching goal in addition to each of the steps of the journey people had to take. And there was really nothing like that in this movie. All the problems we had got resolved by the conclusion. So there isn't really a compelling reason to continue or make people want to keep watching. Also, you have to realize that Lord of the Rings wasn't even a franchise until those movies were made. And I think that's what film studios need to understand. Franchises are not created, they happen. And you can't decide to create a franchise. If you think about every successful franchise, Star Wars, the MCU, it started at 0 and grew in popularity. Well, maybe in the case of Star Wars, but MCU, yes, we already had Marvel Zombies wanting these movies to happen, but there were other people that were brought into the fold, right? And so it grew in popularity. So there needs to be that secret sauce or that X factor that is indefinable. And sometimes it's really hard to capture that in a bottle. But these big studios like Disney, Universal, and now Paramount, they try to keep that good thing going, and it results in a lack of quality. And as far as Dungeons and Dragons, only time will tell. Perhaps fans will love it so much that they want it to keep going. But I just don't see that this has enough uniqueness to make that happen. And if you think about all of the great fantasy movies that we remember from our childhood and the things that made a mark, they weren't franchises for the most part. The Princess Bride, Neverending Story, Willow, they were really one-offs that became cult classics. And perhaps that's why we liked them, because they weren't franchises. They weren't things that we were beaten over the head with. Yes, you can take a game and turn it into a franchise, but maybe you don't always have to do that. Maybe people should make creative, unique stories that are individual things and leave the games to themselves and let them be games and let their fans enjoy those. But on the other hand, maybe I'm wrong. Like I said, it's an entertaining movie, so maybe it'll take off. I just don't see that it lent anything new to the fantasy genre that hasn't been done already a million times before. So that is my review of Dungeons and Dragons: Honor Among Thieves. I'd love to know what you think of my review in the comments. Do you agree with me about franchises? Do you think we really need a Dungeons and Dragons movie? Do you think this will be a success? If you've seen it, let me know what you think of the movie and if you think it needs to continue past this first volume. And that is all I have to say about this movie tonight. So, good evening. This is one of my stories, and I'll see you at the next review. Bye.